So I want to do something with the 3D printer that's a little bit more artsy than the lamp that I did in the first video. And I think my goal for today is to make a little character that I can print out and paint with a little bit more detail than I had in this thing. But that means I'm going to need to learn some new modeling software because what I use right now is designed for engineering applications. It's great for making geometric parts, but not so much for organic sculpture. Also, I had a student license, but I graduated a few months ago, so that's not ideal. So I think I'm going to try and use Blender. Blender does a lot of different things, and a lot of that is animation or image renders, but it also works well for 3D models, or so I've been told. It also comes pre-installed with a monkey head, and that is always a good sign. The only problem, though, is I have no idea how to actually make models in Blender. So I grabbed a snack, pulled up a chair, and started watching some tutorials. So I'm so used to the way that engineering software works for CAD that I kind of assumed I would have to edit stuff by grabbing a section of it and moving it around, and then this is how I would have to sculpt stuff, and it would be a pain in the butt. But apparently, there is just there's a sculpt tab, and you can just kind of actually sculpt things. Which I guess makes sense. I just really wasn't expecting that. So this is going to be easier than I thought it would be, but also, I mean, it's still a challenge because I have never sculpted anything before in the first place, but yeah, so we'll see how it goes. I'm going to start small, do a couple of little things, maybe make something other than this tumor, and we'll see how it goes. Honestly, most of my time on this model was just spent trying to figure out how to navigate the software. There's a good bit of just flailing around and trying to look for the right thing. But more than that, it was just a bit of a struggle to get the brushes to do what I wanted. I had a rough time adding in large chunks of, I'll just call it clay. And you can see that pretty clearly with the real janky looking stem. It took me way too long to figure out how to add clay in the right way so that this thing would look right. I did eventually figure out what I was doing, though, more or less, and I started trying to add in some details. I think that really looked good on this model, but it's pretty hard to grasp the scale of the object while I'm in Blender, so a lot of those details were too small to actually show up in the print. You could kind of see the bumps, but the small lines in between these sections really didn't show up at all. And that's part of why I wanted to start with something small, because it's a good way to learn what I need to actually be doing before I dive into something more complicated. Painting this thing was mostly an excuse to try out some different methods before getting into anything too crazy. I learned that the paint that I'm using doesn't stick all that well to the PLA plastic, so doing a few layers of a base coat was a pretty important first step. After that, I tested some ways to add depth and texture. I tried doing a wash where I would water down the paint a lot, slosh it on, and then wipe off most of it. And then I tried doing some dry brushing where you get most of the paint off the brush before you actually start painting, and then you just sort of smack with it. Both of those things were useful in different ways, and it was a good little experiment for my first time painting in 3D, but nothing too crazy. It's still just a pumpkin. I was trying to learn from the first time by starting myself off with some cylinders so that I would have a flat base, but as it turns out, trying to make an entire character from a single pillar is a terrible idea, so I started over trying to just do one piece at a time. Now, this is going to kind of look like a big blob, but that was also my intention. Digital sculpting is really difficult, to say the least, and the only experience that I've had with this is that pumpkin from a few minutes ago. So I figured pretty much anything I was going to make was going to end up looking messy anyway, and I might as well just lean into that as a style, which is why I decided I wanted to go with the swamp monster. This is the concept art that I spent all of 2 minutes on, so to give you a better idea of what I'm going for here, I want to do this goopy, dripping blob creature crawling his way out of a swamp that he's living in. So not only do I want to have that creature, but I'm also planning on doing a little bit of an environment, which is both just kind of neat, and also that's where I'm going to get that nice flat base for printing off of, because the rest of this whole thing is just messy curves. Anyway, back to this stuff. I sculpted a head that I tried to put a reasonable amount of detail into, and then I did a blob of a body and one arm, which I just duplicate later. I learned a lot going through this whole process, and one of the most useful things that I picked up on was that I could build a rough shape with basic shapes from Blender, join them together, and then sculpt off of that, and it was a lot easier than trying to build up layers of clay. So with all the pieces more or less done, I spent some time arranging, scaling, squishing, and adding a smidge more detail, like some ripples in the water and more drips off his arms. And then I threw the thing on the printer. I tried to design this in a way that it wouldn't need too many temporary supports when printed. The drips on the arms actually double as supports. That was kind of my intent. I did still have some overhangs though, but it wasn't too terrible to print, and the only thing that didn't quite work were these cattails, but they were pretty long and skinny, and I didn't really expect that to work all that well anyway, so not too much of a surprise. Anyway, I took some time to clean this boy up and get to some painting. I used a muddy green for my base coat because I want to go for a dark, swampy vibe. I had actually intended to make this a bit more blue and keep it for the watercolor, but the way that it turned out, I think it actually fits pretty well for my blob creature. I started adding some details in over the grass patch first before moving on to the water. I made the water a bit more blue and then lightened up the high points and the ripples. Pretty happy with the water, not so much with the land, but we'll get back to that later. I tried adding some variation to the color in my creature, but I think I tend to be afraid of having too much contrast in my colors, and I end up overcorrecting and having something that's too monochromatic. I tried getting adventurous with a little bit of purple, and that did help, but I don't think it was enough. Without strong lighting, everything just kind of blends together here. I decided to add in some of the facial detail to see if that would help pull things together. I'm normally pretty good with detail work, but my hands were super shaky here for some reason, and it took me a while to get everything smoothed out. Also, I just find it funny how much of a difference pupils make. He goes from this scary-looking demon thing to as reasonable a gentleman a swamp monster can be. Pretty happy with the way that this thing's been going so far. I think the contrast from the color in the eyes really helped break up the monochromatic scheme of the rest of this guy. And I still might add a little bit of a brighter green to it. I'm not really sure, but I'm mostly happy with that. The thing that's been bothering me is this grass, because it's just too smooth. But it's really hard to print something that chaotic just with the 3D printer just the way that it works. But I always have a little bit of chaos on hand. So my plan is to use this failed print from earlier and kind of see how I can get that in there, paint it green, and maybe make it look a little bit more like grass. We'll see. I started out just trying to organize my chaos a little bit and get it into workable pieces so I could tack it down with a little hot glue. I tried to keep it from being directly by the water so I could have that area still looking muddy, but I covered pretty much everything else. The only thing left now was to meticulously get paint in each of the little crevices in the plastic. This was a much more annoying process than I thought it would be, but I think it was worth it. I really like the way this grass turned out, and I kind of want to add like little flowers or other plants or something, but I think this is one of those projects that I would just keep fiddling with forever, and for the sake of actually putting out a video, I think I'm going to call it here. But I'm pretty happy with the way this guy looks, and just, yeah, he's a little swamp guy. So hopefully you guys enjoyed this, and I'll see you in the next one.